I came home expecting nothing more than a quiet driveway, a dusty car, and maybe a pile of mail. Instead, I found my driveway gone, like it had never existed, like someone had erased it out of reality and replaced it with something straight out of a luxury magazine. And the worst part wasn't just that it was gone. It was where it went. It now led directly into my neighbor's brand new stone courtyard, like my home had suddenly become an extension of his. For a few seconds, I just sat there in my car, engine still running, staring ahead like maybe I had pulled into the wrong street. But no, that old oak tree on the left, the chipped mailbox I kept meaning to fix, the slight slope in the hill. This was my place, or at least it used to be. Except now, instead of my gravel driveway, there was this wide, immaculate brick path, fanned out like a welcome mat for someone else's mansion. And that mansion, well, it belonged to Garrett Holloway. Garrett was the kind of guy who didn't just move into a neighborhood. He took it over without ever saying he would hedge fund money, old family connections, that polished confidence that made people uncomfortable but also weirdly quiet around him. He had bought the biggest property on our hillside about 3 years earlier, and since then it had been nothing but construction, deliveries, upgrades. Every month something new. A wine cellar carved into the hill, a detached guest house, an underground garage, a glass-walled gym that looked like it belonged in LA instead of a sleepy coastal town. And now, apparently, my driveway. I turned off the engine and stepped out slowly, the crunch of gravel gone under my feet, replaced by the hollow, expensive sound of stone. It didn't feel like my ground anymore, like I was trespassing on my own property. And that feeling, that quiet shift in your gut when something's wrong, but you haven't caught up to it yet, that hit me hard. There were workers still around, a couple guys packing up tools. One of them glanced at me, then looked away quickly, like he didn't want to be involved. That told me everything I needed to know. I walked straight across the courtyard toward Garrett's front entrance where he stood with a man in a blazer, probably an architect, both of them looking down at a set of plans spread over the hood of a black SUV. Garrett barely looked up when I got close, just gave me that half smile, like we were neighbors chatting over a fence instead of whatever this was. "Hey," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "What exactly am I looking at here?" He glanced at the courtyard, then back at me, calm as ever. "Improvement," he said, like that explained everything. "My driveway is gone." He shrugged slightly, almost amused. "That old gravel strip? It wasn't technically a driveway, not in any recorded sense, more like an informal access path." I blinked, trying to process how casually he said that. "I've been using it for over 20 years. "Usage doesn't establish ownership," he replied, turning a page on the plans like we were discussing landscaping choices, not the fact that he had just paved over part of my property. The architect shifted uncomfortably but didn't say anything. "I park in that garage," I said, pointing past the courtyard toward my house, now awkwardly disconnected from any clear access. "You just blocked it." Garrett finally looked directly at me then, and there it was, not anger, not even defensiveness, just that quiet certainty that he was right, and I was irrelevant. "You still have access," he said, gesturing broadly at the courtyard. "In fact, it's better now. Cleaner, wider, more cohesive. Think of it as a shared entrance." A shared entrance. I let out a short laugh that didn't feel like mine. "You paved over my driveway without asking me." "I had a survey done," he replied, tapping the papers. "It showed no formal easement registered under your parcel. Legally speaking, I'm within my rights to improve this section." "Improve," I repeated, the words sour in my mouth. He leaned slightly closer, lowering his voice just enough to sound reasonable. "Look, I get that change can feel intrusive, but this raises property values, yours included. You'll thank me eventually." That was the moment something shifted in me. Not loud, not explosive, just a quiet line being crossed. Because this wasn't about a driveway anymore. It was about someone deciding, unilaterally, what parts of your life they could redesign. I took a step back, looked again at the courtyard, the clean lines, the expensive stone, the way it seamlessly blended into his expanded estate, and I realized something else too. This hadn't been a mistake. This was deliberate. And if I didn't do something, it wouldn't stop here. I didn't argue anymore after that. Not right then. I just nodded once, turned around, and walked back across what used to be mine. Every step echoing a little louder than it should have, and when I got to my garage, I just stood there, looking at the closed door, realizing I couldn't even pull my car in without driving straight through his property like a guest. That night, I sat at my kitchen table, lights off, just the glow from a single lamp, going over everything in my head, every small thing I had ignored over the past couple of years, the landscapers who planted hedges too close, then a little closer, the contractors who parked on my gravel without asking, the times Garrett had smiled and said, "We'll sort it out," and I had let it go because it didn't feel worth the fight. Until now. Because now, there was nothing left to ignore. And somewhere between frustration and exhaustion, I remembered something I hadn't thought about in years, something my grandfather used to mention. Back when this whole hillside was just dirt roads and early blueprints. He wasn't just a resident here. He helped build the place. And if that was true, then somewhere, there had to be records. Real ones. Not the kind Garrett's lawyers conveniently interpreted. I got up, walked over to the old storage cabinet in the corner, the one I hadn't opened in years, and started pulling out boxes, papers, folders, rolled up maps tied with fading string, the past, sitting quietly, waiting. I didn't know exactly what I was looking for yet, but I knew one thing for sure. If Garrett thought this was over, he was about to find out it wasn't even close. I didn't sleep much that night. Not because I was angry, though yeah, that was there too, sitting heavy in my chest, but because something else had taken over, something quieter and sharper, curiosity mixed with a kind of stubborn resolve, the kind you get when you realize someone thinks they've already won. By the time the sun came up, my kitchen table looked like a small archive had exploded across it. Yellowed papers, hand-drawn maps, old permits, envelopes with stamps from decades ago. My grandfather, Walter Hayes, had kept everything, not in any organized system that made sense to anyone but him, but enough that if you were patient and a little desperate, you could start to see patterns. And I was both. I found the original subdivision map first, rolled tight and brittle at the edges, dated back to 1956, the year this hillside stopped being farmland and started becoming a neighborhood. Back then, things were simpler, but also, in some ways, more deliberate. They planned not just houses, but how those houses would function together, where water lines ran, where emergency vehicles could pass, where future expansions might need access. I laid the map flat, weighing the corners down with coffee mugs, leaning over it like I was trying to read a language I hadn't spoken in years, and slowly, things started to click. There were lines beneath the surface, not property lines, but something else, marked in faded blue ink, labeled Utility Corridor. They ran like veins through the entire neighborhood, cutting across parcels, ignoring fences, ignoring ownership in the way only infrastructure can, because some things, once built, belong to everyone whether you like it or not. And one of those lines ran directly under what used to be my driveway. I felt that shift again, that quiet click in your head when a piece of the puzzle slides into place. Not enough to celebrate yet, but enough to keep going. I dug deeper, flipping through more documents, until I found a folder thicker than the rest, stamped with the county seal. Easement agreements, official ones, not the vague kind Garrett had been talking about, but permanent rights granted to utility companies, water, gas, electrical, the kind that didn't expire, didn't bend, didn't care how much money someone had. My hands actually paused for a second as I read through one of the pages, the language dense but clear where it mattered. Unrestricted access for maintenance, repair, and emergency intervention. No obstruction permitted. Supersedes private property modifications. I leaned back in my chair, exhaled slowly, and for the first time since I'd come home, I smiled, not big, not triumphant, just enough to feel it. Because Garrett hadn't just paved over my driveway. He had paved over something much bigger. But I wasn't done yet, because if there was one thing I'd learned watching him over the years, it's that people like Garrett don't lose because of one mistake. They lose when those mistakes start stacking. And I had a feeling they were about to. Later that afternoon, I walked the length of that new courtyard again, slower this time. Not as someone trying to reclaim it, but as someone studying it. Really looking, the stonework, the layout, the slight elevations. And then I noticed something I hadn't paid attention to before, small, almost invisible metal markers, half buried at the edges of the courtyard, peeking through the mortar like they didn't belong there anymore. Utility markers. He hadn't even removed them properly, just built over them. I crouched down, brushed some dust away with my fingers, exposing the faint stamped lettering, water line, electrical junction, right there, under all that polished stone. I actually let out a quiet laugh at that. Not because it was funny, but because it was so careless. All that money, all that planning, and he missed this. Or worse, he saw it and thought it didn't matter. That night, I didn't sit around thinking anymore. I started making calls. First to the local utility company, got bounced around a bit until I landed on a guy named Eric. Sounded like he'd been doing the job longer than he wanted to admit. I explained the situation, kept it simple at first, then started mentioning the markers, the easement documents. There was a pause on the other end, the kind where someone stops typing. "You're saying someone built over a primary corridor?" he asked. "Not just built," I said, looking out my window at the courtyard glowing under landscape lights. "They turned it into a centerpiece." Another pause, then, "We're going to need to take a look at that." Next call was to the city planning office. That one took more effort, more explaining, more being put on hold. But once I mentioned emergency access routes, things shifted. Departments talk to each other more than people think, especially when liability gets involved. And then, the fire department. That was the one that sealed it. Because buried in those old maps, there was a designation I hadn't noticed at first. My informal driveway, the one Garrett dismissed so easily, wasn't informal at all. It was a secondary emergency access route. Not for convenience, for safety. For situations where seconds matter more than property lines. And it had been there, documented, approved, for decades. "Is it currently blocked?" the captain asked me over the phone. "Completely," I said. "Send us what you have," he replied, voice tightening just enough. "We'll handle the rest." By Sunday night, I had everything compiled: photos, documents, copies of the maps, even a short video walking the length of the courtyard pointing out the markers. I sent it all out, not with any dramatic message, just facts, clear, simple, undeniable. And then, I waited. Monday morning came slower than usual, the kind of slow where every sound feels amplified. I made coffee I didn't drink, stood by the window more times than I'd admit, watching that courtyard like it might change on its own. Around 9:30, it did. First it was one truck, white, unmarked at a distance, then another, then a third, until the quiet street started filling with vehicles that definitely didn't belong to Garrett's aesthetic. Utility trucks, city vehicles, and then a fire department SUV. I stepped outside just as the first group walked up to the edge of the courtyard, clipboards in hand, eyes scanning, not impressed, not intimidated, just focused. Garrett came out a minute later, still in that same composed way he carried himself, though I could see it now, a slight tension around his jaw, the first crack. "Can I help you?" he asked, voice controlled. One of the utility guys didn't even look up from his tablet. "We're here about the obstruction over the main line corridor." Garrett blinked once. "There must be some mistake." "Doesn't look like one," another guy said, already kneeling near one of the markers I had uncovered. "You've got infrastructure running right under this." The fire captain arrived just after, walking the length of what used to be my driveway, then stopping halfway, looking around like he was mapping it in his head. "This route's listed as emergency access," he said, turning to Garrett. "Why is it blocked?" Garrett glanced briefly toward me then, just for a second, and in that look, there was something new. Not confidence, not yet fear either, but realization. And that was when I knew. This was just getting started. Garrett didn't say anything right away. He just stood there, looking from one official to another like he was trying to figure out which version of this conversation he was supposed to be having. The confident one where he explains everything away, or the careful one where he starts calculating damage. And for the first time since I'd known him, neither seemed to come easily. "I had a survey done," he finally said, a little tighter than before, like he was reaching for familiar ground. "Everything was cleared legally." The fire captain didn't even blink. "Your survey doesn't override a designated emergency access route. And it definitely doesn't override a utility easement," one of the engineers added, already marking something on his tablet. "You've got multiple violations here." Garrett turned slightly toward his architect, who had shown up at some point, standing a step behind him like he wished he could disappear into the hedges. "We accounted for all existing lines," Garrett said, quieter now. The engineer looked up at him, flat. "No, you didn't." That was the moment the tone shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, just a subtle drop in the air, like the temperature changed, and everyone felt it. More officials started moving through the property, not just the courtyard now, but beyond it, toward the side of the house, the lower level, the guest house, clipboards out, cameras snapping photos, people pointing, measuring, cross-checking. I stayed where I was, off to the side, not saying a word, just watching. Because this wasn't my fight anymore. This was the system doing what it was designed to do, slowly, methodically, without emotion. And it was thorough. Within the hour, they had mapped out everything Garrett had built over, and it wasn't just the courtyard. Your wine cellar, one of the city planners said, flipping through documents, is sitting directly above a primary water main. Garrett's head snapped slightly. That's not possible. It is, the planner replied, tapping the page. And it requires unrestricted access. At all times. Another voice, from the back. Home theaters blocking a gas line access point. And the guest house, the fire captain added, eliminates a required fire lane clearance. Each statement landed like a small, controlled detonation, not explosive, but precise, undeniable. Garrett tried to push back. You could see it, the way his posture straightened, the way his voice attempted to reclaim authority. We followed approved renovation plans. The city signed off. The planner shook his head. The plans submitted didn't include these encroachments, which means either they were omitted or altered after approval. That one hit hard, because now this wasn't just about mistakes, it was about intent. Garrett's gaze flicked toward me again, longer this time, and there was no mistaking it now. He knew exactly how this had started, but there was nothing he could do about it. By noon, the decisions started coming in, not as a single announcement, but as a series of quiet, official statements that built on each other until the full weight of it settled in. Immediate cessation of use for the courtyard. Mandatory excavation to restore utility access. Demolition orders for any structure obstructing critical infrastructure. Full compliance required, at the property owner's expense. Garrett didn't argue anymore after that, not out loud. But you could see it happening internally. The calculations, the shifting of strategies, the realization that this wasn't a negotiation he could win with charm or paperwork. At one point, he stepped aside to make a call, pacing near the edge of the property, voice low but sharp, probably lawyers, maybe insurance, but even from a distance, you could tell. This wasn't going the way he expected. I turned back toward my house for a moment, looking at that space where my driveway used to be, or where it would be again, and I felt something I hadn't expected. Not satisfaction. Not exactly. More like balance. Like something that had tilted too far had finally started correcting itself. The real work, though, that came next. Over the following weeks, the courtyard disappeared piece by piece, the same way it had appeared, but in reverse, the clean lines breaking apart, the polished stone pulled up, stacked, hauled away, revealing what had always been underneath. Dirt, pipes, cables, reality. The wine cellar was the biggest loss. I overheard one of the contractors mention the cost in passing, somewhere around $500,000 gone, just like that, carved out, filled in, restored to meet code. The home theater followed, then modifications to the guest house. Each change another reminder that what looks permanent sometimes isn't. Garrett kept a lower profile during that time, still around, still overseeing things, but quieter, less visible, like someone adjusting to a version of the world where they weren't automatically in control. We didn't speak again. Not once. There didn't seem to be a point. About a month into the process, the city started work on restoring the emergency access route, my driveway. Though calling it that felt strange now, it was wider than before, reinforced, graded properly, lined to meet modern fire safety standards, funded, they told me, as part of the compliance corrections. I stood there one afternoon watching them finish the final layer, the surface smooth but still carrying that familiar path I'd driven for years, and I realized something kind of ironic. Garrett had tried to erase it, and ended up upgrading it. 6 months later, a for sale sign went up in front of his house. No big announcement, no farewell party, just a listing that sat for a while before quietly disappearing, and then word spread, the way it always does in places like this, he'd sold. At a loss. A significant one. I never confirmed the exact number, but people talk, and the figure that kept coming up was somewhere around 800,000. Give or take. Last I heard, he moved downtown. High-rise condo, less land, fewer variables, Maybe a place where the ground beneath you is less complicated. As for the house, new owners moved in not long after. Different energy, less ambition. I guess they waved the first week, asked about the neighborhood, brought over a bottle of wine, the normal stuff. No grand redesigns, no disappearing driveways, just people living. And every now and then, when I pull into my garage, I still think about that first day, sitting in my car, staring at something that shouldn't have been possible, and how close I came to just accepting it, letting it slide, because it felt too big to fight. And maybe that's the part that sticks with me the most, not the money, not the demolition, not even Garrett leaving, but that moment where you decide whether something is worth pushing back on, even when it's inconvenient, even when it's uncomfortable. Because sometimes that's the only thing that keeps a line from disappearing completely. So here's what I'm curious about. If you came home one day and found something like that, your space, your boundary, quietly taken and redefined, would you fight it? Or would you let it go and tell yourself it's not worth the trouble? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read more of them than you'd think, and honestly, I'd like to know where you stand on it.